Socialism. Terrifying word.
On Tuesday, November 4th, Zohran Mamdani will probably be elected mayor of New York City. Nothing in politics is ever certain, and I probably shouldn't even be making this prediction, but at the time of this writing, the 34-year-old Democratic Socialist is leading by clear margins in basically every poll. His opponents are a disgraced creep that he already beat once this year, and a Republican in a city that votes overwhelmingly for Democrats. So, the odds are very much in Zohran's favor. But this wasn't inevitable. Zohran has faced enormous opposition, not just from his political enemies, not just from sociopathic billionaires who are terrified of his promise to tax the rich, but also from a seemingly endless parade of right-wing propaganda outlets, who have waged a relentless smear campaign against him. These include, but aren't limited to, Fox News, The New York Post, The Wall Street Journal's opinion page, The Hill, The Federalist, National Review, City Journal, The Washington Examiner, The Washington Free Beacon, The Daily Caller, The Daily Signal, The Daily Wire, The Free Press, The Dispatch, Tablet, The Spectator, Breitbart, Newsmax, OAN, and other websites so vile that I can't bring myself to name them or show them on screen. But that's to be expected, right? No one is surprised when Fox News runs a headline about Mamdani the commie. No one is shocked when the New York Post screams at its readers to prevent the Zohran Mamdani nightmare. Zohran's campaign even made fun of them for it.
I'm going back to Uganda. I'm headed there in a personal capacity to celebrate Rama and I's marriage with our family and friends. And since you will undoubtedly read about this trip in the New York Post, inshallah on the front page, here are a few of my humble suggestions for headlines. MIA, Mamdani in Africa. Uganda miss me. He's completely crazy. He can't be serious. Carl Kampala-Neely investigates Mamdani. Zoe running away.
What's significantly more troubling, at least to me, is how the New York Times has behaved throughout this campaign. While the newspaper is, for the most part, incapable of reaching the same fever pitch of hysteria as Fox News or the Post, the Times has published multiple articles that wouldn't be out of place at some of the right-wing outlets that have gone to war with Zohran. And in this video, we're going to try and figure out why. Let's start with one explanation that I see quite often. As perhaps the most pretentious representative of so-called mainstream media in the US, the New York Times sees itself as a defender of the status quo, and, by extension, of the Democratic Party establishment. Thus, despite its reputation among conservatives as an icon of liberal media, the Times inevitably promotes the interests of corporate-funded and centrist politicians. If you're on the left, there's a good chance that something like this is probably your go-to explanation for why the New York Times seems incapable of reporting fairly on any progressive candidate, whether that was Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020, or Zohran Mamdani in 2025. And while I have a somewhat more complex take, otherwise why would I be making this video, I'm also not here to tell you that this reasoning is necessarily wrong. I think there's ample evidence that the New York Times has a clear blind spot when it comes to covering left-wing causes and candidates. For example, here's one minor but revealing case. Let's listen to New York Times journalist Michael Barbaro interviewing Zohran for an episode of The Daily.
You sit, according to the polls, including our own at the Times, on the cusp of a historic political victory, because at the age of, well, you're now 33, but you'll be 34 just a couple days after this runs. You would be the youngest mayor in a century. You'd be New York City's first Muslim mayor. You'd be its first Democratic Socialist mayor.
Well, I wouldn't actually be the first Democratic Socialist mayor.
Who would it be?
David Dinkins was also a member of the Democratic Socialists
He was
of America.
a co-member of the Democratic Party, right? Is that it?
Well, he was a member of DSA. He identified also as a Democratic Socialist.
Interesting. Thank you for the correction.
Very welcome.
Unaware. You'd be the second Democratic Socialist mayor after David Dinkins.
Now, it's undeniably funny to hear Barbaro make this kind of mistake in front of a potential audience of millions, and be corrected, very kindly, by the person he's interviewing. Though I guess I can at least give him credit for not editing out this part of the interview, which he could easily have done to save face. But the reason I bring this up at all is that it feels significant that Barbaro doesn't seem to know much about the city's progressive history. He knew Zohran would be the youngest mayor in a century. He knew Zohran would be the first Muslim mayor. But Barbaro didn't know that New York City has a history of electing left-wing mayors. And it's a recent history. David Dinkins was mayor in the 1990s, the host of what might be America's most listened to news podcast, should probably know this. I don't think this is an unrealistic expectation. And his ignorance feels indicative of a larger blind spot when it comes to the paper's coverage of the political left. Ultimately, though, I think we can do a bit better than just saying, oh, the Times is biased against left-wing candidates. If you're invested in the success of Zohran's campaign, or in the advancement of progressive politics in general, it probably does feel like a satisfying explanation. I mean, it feels satisfying to me sometimes. But I actually think it obscures other, more interesting dynamics at play here. Because here's the thing. Whatever else you want to say about Zohran's campaign, he clearly showed that a candidate can build a viable movement without worrying about traditional communication channels. Zohran didn't manage to get from polling in the single digits to winning the Democratic primary because of TV spots or newspaper Q&As, like the ones that he did with the New York Times. No, he built name recognition through a powerful and disciplined door-knocking and canvassing game, and a genuinely impressive social media strategy. He didn't really need the Times to get his message out. And to be honest, I doubt he was too worried about their hit pieces either. Here's what fascinates me and made me want to make this video in the first place. I think it's fair to say that the influence of traditional media outlets is on the decline. As a society, we're headed for a future where most people get their political news and opinions from influencers, podcasters, and streamers. Honestly, that future might have already arrived. I made a video that's kind of about this. You can go watch it if you want. I'll put the link in the description. The New York Times knows this. They're not stupid. And they've done their best to adapt. They're on YouTube and TikTok, and sometimes their videos do okay numbers. And I don't have any special insight into how the Times thinks or makes decisions about how to cover a candidate like Zohran, but I can't shake the feeling that some of their editorial choices during this campaign were driven by a sense of anxiety. A feeling that their status as gatekeepers and shapers of public opinion is slipping away. I've been sort of talking in abstract terms here. Let's take a look at a specific example. It's an editorial the Times published right before June's Democratic primary. Our advice to voters in a vexing race for New York mayor. First, some context. In August of 2024, the Times announced it would no longer endorse candidates in New York elections. While the paper reserved the right to weigh in on presidential races, it would no longer take an official position on state and local races, which includes the mayor of New York City. The Times had issued endorsements in local elections since 1897, when it backed Republican candidate Seth Low for mayor. Quote, "A multitude of indications point to the election of Seth Low. The intelligence of the community is a fundamental reason for confidence. They cannot be so perversely blind and blundering as to elect Robert Van Wyck," the Times wrote in 1897. That year, the city elected Robert Van Wyck as mayor. Maybe the newspaper's anxiety over its waning influence is a bit misplaced. It's not really clear why the Times decided to stop endorsing local candidates, and the editor of the opinion section, which has historically issued these endorsements, didn't even explain to reporters at her own newspaper. She did not give a reason for the shift, but said that opinion will continue to offer perspective on the races, candidates, and issues at stake. Oh, they'll offer perspective, huh? Okay, let's see what that looks like in practice. We do not believe that Mr. Mamdani deserves a spot on New Yorkers' ballots. His experience is too thin, and his agenda reads like a turbocharged version of Bill de Blasio's dismaying mayoralty. As for Mr. Cuomo, we have serious objections to his ethics and conduct, even if he would be better for New York's future than Mr. Mamdani. If you wanted to be a pedant, I suppose you could argue that the Times technically didn't tell anyone who they should vote for, and even said explicitly in the piece that we are not endorsing a candidate. But come on. In the old days, the Times at least professed a certain amount of confidence in the intelligence of its readers, as when it confidently, though wrongly, asserted in 1897 that they could not possibly be so stupid as to elect the wrong candidate. Now it doesn't even respect its readers enough to follow the spirit of its brand new policy. Let's look at another article. This one's not an editorial or an opinion piece. It's a straightforward news story. Mamdani says he will apologize for calling the NYPD racist in 2020. Basically, the story is about this tweet, that Zohran posted in 2020, during the height of the George Floyd protests. Zohran said he would apologize for it. And that's the story. I like this one a lot. Not because it's good, but because it gives me a good excuse to talk about how news gets made. One of the first things every beginning reporter internalizes, whether in journalism school or at their first job, is this concept of newsworthiness. It's basically a catch-all term for all the possible reasons a journalist might use to justify writing about something. There's a hurricane bearing down on Florida. It's going to have an immediate impact on a bunch of people's lives. That's newsworthy. The president just said something insane. He's the most powerful person in the country. That's newsworthy. And so on and so forth. Media scholars have tried to come up with fancy theoretical frameworks that capture what it means for something to be newsworthy. But in my experience, and I've worked in a few newsrooms, deciding whether or not something is newsworthy often just comes down to a reporter's intuition. Unfortunately, newsworthiness can also become a retroactive rationalization for decisions about news coverage that are made for ideological reasons. Maybe you see where I'm going with this. Is the fact that Zohran said he'll apologize for calling cops racist newsworthy? I think the answer is yes. On the other hand, what if Zohran had actually doubled down on his criticism, refused to apologize, and said he unequivocally stood by his old tweet? Would that be newsworthy? And I think the answer is also yes. I bring this up because it illustrates how easily a news organization like The Times can manufacture a story based on its ideological priorities. Zohran is running to be the mayor of New York City, and the mayor of New York City is ultimately in charge of the NYPD, so obviously his opinions of the cops do matter. However, Zohran didn't spontaneously hold a press conference or release a snappy video with an apology to the cops. The New York Times brought this up and chose to frame their questions not around how Zohran might improve or change the NYPD, but whether the police deserved an apology for a tweet. It's right here in the text of the story. When he was asked if he should apologize to the city's police officers, Mamdani paused noticeably before answering. He then went on to explain how his views had changed. After he was asked again if he owed officers an apology, he said, "Yes. I want to be very clear. When I say the Times manufactured this story, I'm not calling it fake news. I'm not accusing the Times of making something up. Zohran really did say he would apologize to the NYPD. However, I think it's important to stress that this story only exists because reporters and editors at the Times decided that whether or not he apologized for a tweet he made 5 years ago was more important than anything else they could have asked him during this interview. The Times clearly has the right to ask him any question they want. I think it's important and necessary that journalists are able to do this, but we should understand that the story isn't simply a matter of reporting what happened. Reporters shape what news is based on their own values, whether they intend to or not. And in this case, the Times decided that cops with hurt feelings was an important campaign issue. I think it's also worth noting that this is the same approach Fox News took when interviewing Zohran, and that's not a very flattering comparison if you're the New York Times. It's true that Zohran's political opponents had already made a big deal about his tweet, but it was ultimately the press, and in this case, the New York Times, that put him on the spot and forced him into a position where he had to treat an old social media post as a serious issue. This is a form of power, a form of influence. The Times may not be able to pick which candidates voters choose, their explicit endorsements may carry no weight with the city, but they can still influence how a candidate behaves. And I think this is an important factor in explaining why the Times covered the race the way that it did. As much as some news reporters like to cast themselves as neutral and impartial observers, the truth is that the political press has always been an active participant in the American political process. Okay, let's do one more story. Remember how I said some of the stuff the Times wrote about Zohran wouldn't be out of place in a conservative tabloid? Well, this is one of them. I started writing a very different version of this script back in July, when this story was first published. But then, because people immediately recognized how horrible the story was, it got talked about and analyzed and critiqued until I started to feel like I didn't have anything to say. Or at least, nothing that hadn't already been articulated better in the tidal wave of discourse that swamped my Blue Sky feed. I still don't know if I have anything to say, but a video about how the New York Times covered Zohran's campaign that didn't touch on this story would feel really incomplete. So here I go. I'll do my best to say something interesting. For anyone who has only recently started paying attention to the mayor's race, or has forgotten this particular piece of journalistic malpractice, here is my best attempt at a summary, with as much neutrality and objectivity as I can muster. I'm sure the New York Times would approve. On Thursday, July 3rd of this year, the New York Times published a story stating that when Zohran Mamdani was a high school senior applying to colleges back in 2009, he checked off boxes on his application to Columbia, the Ivy League school in New York City, stating that he was both Asian, and Black or African American. These details about Zohran's college application, information that would normally be confidential, were provided to the Times by a source that the story originally described as, quote, an academic and opponent of affirmative action. The Times did not name this source, but instead referred to them by their Twitter and Substack handle. How did this unnamed person acquire Zohran's college application? They received it from a hacker, also unnamed in the story, who had targeted Columbia and stolen a database containing millions of student applications, ostensibly to investigate whether the school was still using affirmative action to make decisions about student admissions, a practice which is now illegal. When approached by the New York Times, Zohran confirmed that this hacked data was authentic. He did check those boxes, but he also told the Times that he doesn't identify as Black or African American, but rather as an American who was born in Africa, more specifically in Uganda. Zohran told the Times, quote, most college applications don't have a box for Indian Ugandans, so I checked multiple boxes trying to capture the fullness of my background. So let's talk about some of the things that are missing both from this description and from the New York Times story itself. Number 1. The source who provided the Times with Zohran's admissions data is a eugenicist named Jordan Lasker. This guy. He's a failed academic who peddles debunked pseudoscience that claims black people are inherently less intelligent than people of other races. Number 2. The hacker who stole data from Columbia is a Trump-supporting Nazi who uses a racial slur as their Twitter handle. I really want to emphasize just how vile this person is, so I'm going to quote from a piece that reporter Liz Lopato wrote for The Verge. Quote, the ultimate source for the New York Times' story about Zohran Mamdani's college application is an open secret. It's an anime-loving neo-Nazi whose hobbies include furry drawings, posting fan art of a video game character, and hacking universities. On X, the alleged hacker is followed by New York Times freelancer Benjamin Ryan, who was the first byline on the Mamdani story. The alleged hacker uses an online handle that is a racial slur, so I will be referring to them as the anime Nazi. They have taken credit for 5 hacks of universities. 3 of them, as first reported by Bloomberg, targeted the University of Minnesota, New York University, and Columbia University. The Verge then quotes a bunch of heinously racist things this person posted on their Twitter and Fediverse accounts, and I didn't actually want to read any of this stuff out loud, even as quotes, so I'll put that paragraph on screen. It's a bit concerning that I have to mention the phrase anime Nazi in a video that's supposed to be about, New York City's next mayor. But here's the thing. You can believe that teenage Zohran was wrong to check a box, stating that he was Black or African American. Personally, I find his explanation that he was doing his best to fully represent his complex background convincing. But maybe you don't. And that's okay. I'm not really here to defend the choices of a 16-year-old. I hope we can just agree that Zohran's lapse of judgment is far less concerning than the fact that the New York Times was willing to launder information obtained by a Nazi and a race big scare quotes here, scientist, and hide that from their audience. The paper granted anonymity to Lasker, and seemingly didn't bother to even ask about the anime Nazi's identity, and by doing so, the Times disregarded its own guidelines about when and how to use anonymous sources. These guidelines are quite clear that Times journalists are supposed to consider a source's motivation before shielding their identity. And the fact that Lasker and the anime Nazi are motivated by virulent racism definitely seems relevant to me. And while I'm unloading my grievances, I also want to mention that the Times repeatedly changed this story after it was published without making this clear to their readers. Hilariously, the edits they made were to the paragraph about Lasker. They still didn't name him, but they finally did mention that, people already know who this is, and also that he, quote, writes often about IQ and race. Okay, but what did he write about IQ and race? Can you be more specific? I know you Googled him, New York Times. You can't fool me. I know you know. Okay, let's pull ourselves out of this rabbit hole and try to get the video back on track. I promised to make some interesting observations about this hot mess of a story, so let's do that and maybe try to wrap this thing up. I sometimes think about journalism as a series of choices. Choices about who to talk to. Choices about what details to include and what details to leave out. For example, the New York Times made a choice to frame this article as a story about Zohran attempting to cheat the college application system and cynically benefit from affirmative action. The story doesn't state this outright, but it doesn't need to. It's all there in the first 3 paragraphs. It's an accusation by implication. As he runs for mayor of New York City, Zohran Mamdani has made his identity as a Muslim immigrant of South Asian descent a key part of his appeal. But as a high school senior in 2009, Mr. Mamdani, the Democratic nominee, claimed another label when he applied to Columbia University. Asked to identify his race, he checked a box that he was Asian, but also Black or African American, according to internal data derived from a hack of Columbia University that was shared with the New York Times. Columbia, like many elite universities, used a race-conscious affirmative action admissions program at the time. Reporting that his race was Black or African American in addition to Asian could have given an advantage to Mr. Mamdani, who was born in Uganda and spent his earliest years there. By the way, Zohran was not admitted to Columbia. The choice to not include this fact in the first 3 paragraphs, but instead to bury it in a parenthetical later in the story, is telling. But there was another more important choice the New York Times made. More important than how they framed this story. More important than who they talked to or how they wrote it. And that was the choice of whether to publish it at all. On July 5th, 2 days after the story published, Patrick Healy, the assistant managing editor for Standards and Trust at the Times, posted a tweet thread that attempted to explain the paper's decision-making process. It's a bit long, but I've been really critical of this story, so in the interest of fairness, let's go through it tweet by tweet. As the New York Times assistant managing editor for Standards and Trust, I've received reader feedback regarding our reporting on Zohran Mamdani's 2009 application to Columbia. Yeah, I bet you have. To provide some context on how the reporting came together, I wanted to share some information. The Times has been reporting comprehensively on Mr. Mamdani's proposals for the city, his vision on the economy and affordability, his leadership record, and his personal background, including his biography and South Asian heritage that he's talked about during his campaign. Times journalists for decades have done deep reporting on major party nominees for New York's mayor to provide insight, context, and texture about their priorities, history, and evolution. Not entirely sure what he means by texture here, but that's neither here nor there. Our reporting helps readers better understand how candidates think and what they believe. Our reporters obtained information about Mr. Mamdani's Columbia College application and went to the Mamdani campaign with it. When we hear anything of news value, we try to confirm it through direct sources. Mr. Mamdani confirmed this information in an interview with the Times. Mr. Mamdani shared his thinking about the limitations of identity boxes on forms like Columbia's, and explained how he wrote in Uganda, the country of his birth, the kind of decision many people with overlapping identities have wrestled when confronted with such boxes. Yes, it's about the boxes. This is why he wrote the story. Because people are sometimes confronted by boxes. We believe Mr. Mamdani's thinking and decision-making laid out in his words was newsworthy, and in line with our mission to help readers better know and understand top candidates for major offices. So this right here, this is the only public justification the Times has ever offered for why this story should have been published in the first place. And Patrick's reasoning is that Zohran's college application was newsworthy because it gave readers and potential voters a meaningful insight into who he is and how he operates. I'm sorry, what? This story was not a fluffy profile. It was not a deep dive into Zohran's thinking that helped potential voters understand how he might behave as mayor. Remember, that's the context for this. He's running for mayor. Personally, I don't really think that the actions someone took when they were 16 or 17 is a very good indicator of how they will act as an adult. For example, when I was 16, I was an Ayn Rand reading libertarian, and here I am now saying nice things about a democratic socialist. As Healy indicates, the Times has reported comprehensively on Zohran as a candidate, which, and I have to admit this, includes some stories that are actually good. There's this opinion piece from columnist M. Gesson about the false accusations of anti-Semitism that have been leveled against Zohran throughout the campaign. And there's this one about how young Muslim voters convinced their skeptical or just disengaged parents to come out and vote for Zohran in the primary. And finally, there's this very long and well-written profile in which a Times reporter recounts what it was like to literally walk the campaign trail with Zohran. But these examples of actual, useful journalism just make the story about the college admissions box-checking pseudo-scandal look even worse by comparison. I can only talk about so many things in this video, but trust me when I say this. I read every story the Times published about Zohran's campaign. I even made a spreadsheet. Look, here it is. hours of my life. Utterly wasted. What am I doing? But I kept returning to this piece of garbage story, and it became the baseline against which I was forced to measure everything else the Times wrote. Moreover, it has become my go-to example of the way a vicious political hit can be cloaked in anodyne language. It's a smear that disguises itself as investigative reporting, and in that way, is more insidious than 1,000 screaming headlines about Mamdani the commie. Because here's what Patrick Healy didn't tell you in his tweet thread. You want to know another big reason the Times published this at all? They were worried about someone else beating them to the story. And it wasn't another news outlet. It wasn't CNN or the Wall Street Journal or even the goddamn New York Post. They were worried about far-right activist and rabid Twitter poster Christopher Rufo, best known for his cynical campaign to transform critical race theory into a conservative boogeyman. The Times saw itself as being in competition with a man who openly and clearly states that his entire strategy as an activist is to manipulate media outlets into providing coverage of issues in ways that will benefit the far right. I find this both concerning and interesting. It's concerning for what I hope are obvious reasons. The fact that a mainstream news organization with 12 million subscribers actively worries about getting scooped by a Twitter troll is not what I would call a good sign for the health of America's free press. But it's also interesting, because I think it is yet another sign of institutional insecurity at the Times. It's more evidence that the people in charge are anxious about their relevance. And it's deeply ironic that in their rush to stay ahead of Christopher Rufo, they allowed someone like him to dictate what was newsworthy at all. To be honest, it was hard to find a place to end this video and still get it out before Election Day. I could have kept talking about any number of New York Times stories because, well, obviously they're going to cover the mayor's race right up until the end, and they just kept on publishing stories that each could have gotten their own section in this video. Literally, on the day I was finalizing edits, the Times dropped an article about how some Zohran supporters are concerned about his, quote, thin resume. A headline with a very silly premise, given that you could find some Zohran supporters that believe just about anything, if you look hard enough. But I could only do so much. I had to call it quits somewhere.